Hey guys, welcome to this new video about Konami's problem with pendulums. Now you might wonder, okay, but what does he mean by that? I do not think that Konami hates pendulums. We hear from the community often a cry about Konami would hate pendulums, and that is the reason why they're excluded from the MR4 revision, and that's the reason why we not often get really good generic pendulum support. However, I don't think that's really the case. I think Konami just has a really hard time designing good pendulum support because pendulum itself as a mechanic has an inherent design problem that I want to address in this video. I want to talk about what makes it so different from all the other mechanics and why we never get really good generic pendulum support. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I think one of the problems why we never get good generic pendulum support is because in the past, Pendulum often was played as one big pendulum deck. You didn't play specifically Endymion or Mythical Beasts or Amorphages or whatever pendulum deck you can think of, Oddice, whatever. But you instead just played a bunch of generic good pendulums and comboed with that, and I don't think that's what Konami wanted to see. I also don't think that's what we should see. I think that's pretty unhealthy for the game, and I still don't like that because of that era we refer to Pendulum as a deck. I feel like we should refer to the deck what it is. So like if you're playing Endymion, you're playing Endymion. If you're playing Endymion with Mythical Beasts, you're playing Endymion with Mythical Beasts. You're not playing just Pendulum, because if I asked someone what he's playing it, he would tell me, yeah, I'm playing Fusion. When he plays Fluffle, I would be like, what the fuck? So we shouldn't do that with Pendulums. And I will refer to Pendulum as mechanic in this video. If I mean one specific deck, I will say the deck name because that's what the deck name is for. So yeah, I hope you guys are tuned in, and let's get this party started. The first issue I want to address is the balancing of pendulum monsters. To balance one specific pendulum monster, you have to consider so much more than you have to consider for any other monster type. For synchros, you just have to consider, okay, how generic is it? What kind of tuner do you need? Is it worth the payout? For normal effect monsters, you just have to consider, okay, how easily is it accessible? Is it maybe level 4 so I can normal summon it? Maybe does it search a normal summon? What does it search? For pendulums, you not only have to look at how easily accessible it is, also in the context of pendulum summoning, and how good of a normal summon and how good of a monster effect it has, but also how good of a scale it is and how good its scale effect is. That's way more to look at, especially since you need to consider all the other pendulum cards you could play with them as well, which makes it really hard to design good pendulum support. However, that also leads to some fullness because you can balance pendulum monsters on way more different stages than you can balance a normal monster. For example, you want to have a pendulum monster that's good because it has a really high scale. You just give it a restriction in its pendulum scale effect, which makes it so it's balanced out. So for example, if you look at something that like Supreme Gate Infinity, it has a 13 scale, which is a really high scale, which allows you to pendulum summon anything as long as you have a good low scale, but you can only summon while you control no monsters, so it just gets balanced out over that. On top of that, you can do the other way around. You can give it a really strong scale effect, but a really bad scale. One example for that would be Abyss Ragnarok from DDDs. For DDD, 5 is probably the worst scale you can have. But on the other side, Ragnarok's scale effect is really strong because it just revives a monster. Just plain summon something from your graveyard and then have some DDD restrictions. So like, there's a lot of adjustments to pendulums you can make to balance them over their scale effect, but also you can balance them like normal monsters over their monster effect or their accessibility. Especially in pendulums, you can do that with the level of the monster. For example, level 8 is way harder to summon than a level 7, since most pendulum decks have scales from 1 to 8 or something like that. So there are a lot of adjustments you can make to balance out a pendulum monster. But there are also a lot of adjustments you have to make to balance out a pendulum monster, which makes it not easy to design a good balanced out pendulum monster, or like at least to design a lot of them. Which also leads to another problem, that is, if you have too many good generic pendulums, we see exactly what I criticized in the intro. You just splash them into one deck, call it its pendulum, it's just generic pendulum, and that's it. Therefore, you need a lot of restrictions on all the different pendulums to make them only playable inside of the archetype. But that takes away from the wonderful aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is combining different decks to some kind of hybrid or using different strategies that support each other, which would be very given for Pendulums, because if you have two Pendulum decks, it's not far off to take them together and see if they synergize, especially since a lot of Pendulum cards are spellcasters and you have synergy with that as well. So putting on too many restrictions on Pendulums is bad for combining decks, which is one of the parts that makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Interesting, and also limits the payout of the deck, which makes the deck inherently worse. But on the other side, it's also kinda necessary just to not make Pendulums super splashable, because if you would have all the Pendulums without any restrictions, you could just splash all the good Pendulums into one big deck and see what they're doing, and that's exactly what we don't want to see. At least that's what I don't want to see, and I think that's also what Konami doesn't want to see, depending on their choices they did in the past, and I think they learned from their mistake, and they'd want to let that happen again. Furthermore, Pendulums have one specific weakness. This weakness is spell and trap removal, because you need your Pendulum scales set to Pendulum summon and they are treated as spell card, therefore your opponent can just simply destroy them with something like an MST or Twin Twist or whatever spell and trap removal they have. Now you can do two things to conquer that weakness. Either you give the scales protection, as we can see with something like Pentacall, for example, or what was way more commonly used from Konami, you give your scales and other cards in your deck effect that trigger on destruction of other cards to conquer that weakness. Something like Astrograph or Electromite, that just like take this disadvantage of if your scales are destroyed, you have a problem, and turn them into something better. Purple Poison is also a good example for that. However, Konami then took that a stage too far. We had this mechanic implemented that lets you come back after your cards are destroyed, and then Konami released cards that destroy your own cards to trigger those, which makes your deck way faster, but also leads to these comeback cards being reusable in your first turn, and the thing with comeback cards is that they're usually pretty strong. I mean, something like Zeus is a comeback card, so. And that led to Pendulum being able to destroy their own cards using very strong comeback effects, like, for example, Astrograph, which is now banned because of how strong it was. And just go plus even more, and you made a deck that relied on constant long-term Pendulum summoning each and every turn to outgrind your opponent into a big combo deck that just pens 5, lays 7 negates out, and just then out-decays your opponent. And on the one side, that's okay, because imagine all Pendulum decks would be control decks, would be kind of weird. On the other side, I don't think the way it was handled from Konami was correct, because I feel like they learned from their mistakes and they're not printing that many good cards that destroy your Pendulums and then plus off of that. But on the other side, that leads to the community being kind of mad about that, because they now saw how much potential that has, and now this potential is just gone because we don't get any other cards. I'm not saying it's incorrect that we don't get any other cards for that. I think that's pretty right. I just feel like that's one of the reasons why the community is so mad at Konami for never giving us good Pendulum support, because good Pendulum support in the eyes of the community is exactly that facilitates strong first turn combos, and that's just not what Konami wants Pendulum to be, at least if you look at the mechanic. But that's a topic I'm gonna talk about now. So there's the other issue with Pendulums that makes them inherently different from all the other mechanics. Let's take a brief look over the other mechanics and then just compare them to Pendulums. So the probably worst mechanic, if you ask the community, would be rituals. What do rituals need? Rituals need a ritual spell, a ritual monster, and monsters to tribute for that. At least that's the basic concept. Of course there are exceptions nowadays, but talking about the basic concept, you need 2 specific cards and just generic tribute over. That's okay most of the time. You needing 2 specific cards is a bit expensive, but you get a pretty okay payout, except there aren't good rituals. But the concept idea was that you get a good payout. So that, for example, that you summon a 3k beatstick in a format where 2500 is the cap, and that you get this beatstick pretty easily compared to something like tribute summoning a Blue Eyes. Then if you look at fusions, how they were originally designed, you needed 2 specific monsters and polymerization. It was actually worse than rituals back in the day because you needed 3 specific cards. You needed both the monsters and the polymerization. All of them you needed to draw to your hand. They're not supposed to die. You can't use any monster you want to. You need 2 very specific ones. But the payout was kind of identical to ritual summoning. You get a big boy and you don't need to keep your board presence up until you can summon that big boy, as you would need, for example, for Blue Eyes. Nowadays, both of these decks have received pretty decent support. For rituals, we got a lot of searchers because, like I said, you still need 2 specific cards, and that will never change for rituals, or like it never inherently change. We already have some generic ritual spells which help a bit, but I don't think we will see a ritual spell that just says ritual summon a ritual monster. That's it. For a long time, there are obviously some kind of restriction to it. And of course you need your ritual monsters, so the deck received a lot of searchers and also monsters that just generate levels you can tribute, with of course restrictions, so the spamming of monsters isn't used just to link them away. I'm thinking about the incantations right now. They summon 2 bodies out of the deck with pretty high levels, search you something, then you just are set up for a ritual summon. For fusions, it's pretty simple. Most fusion decks are just way more generic. You still need some kind of fusion card, but most decks have those, or they can search polymerization pretty easily. Talking about Fluffles before, I think that's a good example. They have a spell card that searches polymerization, and that spell card is searched by another card in the deck, so it's pretty accessible. And on top of that, fusion monsters are way more generic. Don't need 2 specific monsters, you just need 2 kinds of monsters. For example, you need a machine and a dragon, or you need a Fluffle and a Edgem, or something like that, which makes it way more easy to fusion summon, but it's still a minus. You still get big bodies, but it's way easier to perform. If we then look at the a bit faster mechanics, Synchro, Xyz, and Link summoning. For Synchro, you always need a tuner and a non-tuner. At the beginning, you also needed one specific tuner, but we are now at the point where you also just need any tuner, any non-tuner. You can make a Synchro that's pretty generic, especially since we got a lot of good tuners over the course of the years. And we also got some Link monsters that support that. For Xyz, you just need 2 monsters with the same level. That's pretty easily acquirable for most decks, because most decks play cards with the same level, and if it fits, you can just overlay them into pretty strong Xyz monsters. So getting to an Xyz monster is pretty simple, and the same for Link summoning. Link summoning needs some kind of monsters. The exact conditions are always printed on the Link monster. They are very different ones. You can even Link climb with Link monsters. Link monsters have pretty strong effects. They enable a lot of good combos nowadays because a lot of them are extenders from the extra deck, and they're just easy to make. Now, all of these mechanics are missing one specific thing that Pendulum has. Let's look at Pendulums. Pendulums need 3 cards at least, like Rituals and Fusions in the beginning. You need 2 scales and a monster to, out of nowhere with an empty board, set up a Pendulum summon. You need to activate 2 scales. These scales have to be good scales, or like at least fitting scales. And then you need to Pendulum summon the 3rd monster that's fitting between the scales. To make a good Pendulum summon, a Pendulum summon that's worth it, you actually need even more cards. Because for a good Pendulum summon, you usually want to pend like at least 2, maybe even 3 or 4 monsters. So you need 4 to 6 cards to make Pendulum summon workable from the beginning, from the start, from the crackback. It's just very high investment for not that great payout. However, Pendulums are recursive. That's the one huge difference to all the other mechanics. What I just explained to you sounds like a big minus for the first turn setup. But once you are set up, once you have your scales set, and once you have a way to Pendulum summon, talking about MR3 Pendulums right now, just to clarify, you can Pendulum in 5 monsters each turn. And every turn you draw into more cards, the monsters you summon can generate more advantage, get you more monsters that you can Pendulum summon the next turn, and you can every turn, as long as your scales stay on the field, Pendulum summon again and again and again. And that's the one big problem with Pendulums. On the one side, Pendulums need a way to turbo out scales and sub monsters to make the Pendulum summon worth it in the beginning. on the other side, Pendulum summoning gets stronger every turn. So the cards you Pendulum summon and the cards that help you to get you to your Pendulum cards can't be too strong, because if they're too strong, you just keep repeating these really strong cards that let you go +3 or whatever every single turn, and you just overwhelm your opponent so incredibly fast that it's not even fair anymore. And I think that's the one really big issue Konami has with Pendulums. Or had with Pendulums, I should say. Because then we got MR4 revision, or just MR4 in itself, and you weren't able to Pendulum summon that easy anymore. You weren't able to Pendulum summon just 5 monsters every turn. You needed link monsters to set that up. And I think that's a pretty good balancing aspect for the deck. Just because it makes it so you still have this pretty strong mechanic that can get you 3 or 4 monsters for nothing, because you can reuse the ones you already used from your extra deck. But on the other side, you need to keep link monsters on the board that have good arrows. You need to get to the link monsters if your opponent removes them. So your Pendulum summon depends on a lot of things, not only your scales, but now also the link arrows you have. So your opponent has more ways to stop you from getting a big Pendulum summon every turn. It's not easy to stop you for the first turn or maybe the second turn, but they can always try to kill your link monster or pop your scale. They have more options to attack the deck. And I think that's a pretty good balancing for the deck. I'm honest with you, I think that's a pretty good balancing. But I also think Konami is a bit too cautious with Pendulums. I'm known for not being that big of a Pendulum fan. There are some Pendulum decks I really like, but as a mechanic and as a just big splashable pile of cards Pendulum, I'm not a fan of that. But I think Konami could give us a bit better Pendulum support. Now the question is, how would that support look like? And I think something like Skullcrabat is pretty good Pendulum support. It searches you a card on normal summon, which means you can get plus off of it, but it doesn't do anything on special summon. So if you Pendulum summon it back, it's just a vanilla. And I think something like that is pretty okay for the mechanic. I think we need more of that. And also Konami should stop trying to get around this if a card gets destroyed, then shit happens mechanic, because there aren't a lot of good Pendulum cards that destroy cards in the current format. As long as you don't print cards that destroy, you can print cards that trigger on destruction as a comeback mechanic. That's completely fine. It's not a problem at all. And yeah, I think like that's the big problem Konami has with Pendulums. I don't think there's an inherent fix to it. I think the mechanic is just flawed and we have to live with it. But I think there could be a bit better Pendulum support without breaking the deck. Overall, I think it's pretty interesting that we have just this one mechanic that has such a reliable comeback with just Pendulum summon every turn, and Konami never did that again because they saw what it led to. And I also don't think it's bad to have a flawed mechanic in your card game. Like that doesn't mean you have to remove it. Everyone makes mistakes, it's normal, and as long as you are cautious with that mechanic without being over cautious, you're pretty good set. Like I don't think there's an inherent big problem if you have a mechanic that has some flaws, because in the end every mechanic has some flaws, right? Rituals are big minus and not worth the payout. Fusions are also pretty minus, and to make them worth the payout you need to be creative with them. Synchromancers always need a tuner, so if you don't draw a tuner you have a big problem on that. Exeses are very limited in their effect uses because of Exes materials, and link monsters are a mistake. And that concludes our short adventure about Pendulums. I think I said everything I wanted to say. I think I explained that alright. Leave me a reply in the comments if I actually did that, if you understand what I meant. And if you disagree or agree with something, put it in the comments. We are always up for discussion. I'm down to see your opinion on that. And I think there's one last question I need to answer. One last question a lot of you are asking themselves and are going to ask in the comments anyway, so I'm going to answer that now. The question I'm thinking of is, should Electromite come back off the ban list? My answer to that is no. What the fuck? But that's a topic for another video. Have a good day, guys.